For thousands of years, man has looked to the heavens in awe and prayed to a number of different gods. Today, large radio telescopes stare into space, searching the cosmos for clues about our existence. For centuries, scientists, including Einstein, have seen the unity of the universe as so astonishing that it can command a spiritual wonder. Back on Earth, that spiritual wonder has, for time immemorial, manifested itself in any number of structures and buildings dedicated to a variety of gods. From the southern tip of Cornwall to the cliffs of Orkney, and from an island off the east coast to another off the west coast, Britain is touched by spiritual places, whether from myths and legends of ancient times or the rise of today's great religions. Spiritual and sacred places, sanctified by centuries of worship, cover the country, from prehistory pagan sites on windy mountaintops to magnificent cathedrals across the country. These places have been inspiring wonder in man for generations. Some places are so ancient that their use can only be open to speculation. Other spiritual places are more modern and part of Britain's diverse religious landscape. For centuries, human beings have built sacred places, and some of the finest are all the parish churches that stand in the centre of villages across the country. They have become more than just spiritual places. They are part of the fabric of Britain and a part of history that stretches back to the Normans and beyond. This aerial journey will show how they, and all the other sacred and secular places, have shaped the landscape of spiritual Britain. It's not possible to travel very far in Britain without passing by a spiritual site, whether a country church or a city cathedral. There are also countless other spiritual and religious buildings, from synagogues to Buddhist centres and mosques to Hindu temples. And look deeper into the landscape and hundreds of other sacred sites emerge, some going back into the mists of time. Carved into the white chalk hills of Uffington in Oxfordshire is a giant figure. This astonishingly graphic outline was first shaped 3,000 years ago. What is it? Who put it there? And why? It looks like a horse, possibly an image of the horse goddess Epona. But legend tells us it may be the dragon slain by St. George, patron saint of England. It's said that where the dragon's blood spilt on the nearby hill, no grass will grow. The whole figure can only be seen from the air. How did its creators manage to lay it out so perfectly? Perhaps that is why these spiritual places are still so popular to visit, because we do not really know what they represent, and so we can allow our imaginations to take over. The Ridgeway, the oldest road in England, passes near to the White Horse and also a Celtic hill fort. Sticking to the high ground for safety, away from the dangers in wooded valleys, this ancient track ran from the English Channel to Norfolk on the North Sea. Walk along it today and you walk in the footsteps of Celts, Romans, Saxons, Vikings and Normans. This conical mound is entirely man-made. Over 40 metres high, it contains 12 million cubic feet of chalk, It's been reckoned that 700 labourers toiled for 10 years to raise it, and all this nearly 5,000 years ago. And for what? It must have been of prime importance to attract such a mighty effort, but despite intense research, little is known, because nothing has been found. Better perhaps to credit the early legend that it shelters the body of an ancient king, sat upright on his battle horse, the pair of them encased in golden armour. We do know that Silbury formed part of a bigger scheme, the Avebury Ritual Complex. Here, a long avenue of standing stones formed a processional way to a huge earthwork, itself surrounded by a stone circle of enormous size. These mysterious stones, seen of long disappeared pagan rites, worried the Catholic Church so much that they had them felled in the Middle Ages. One member of the demolition crew died when one of these monsters fell on him, and his body, together with the tools of his barber-surgeon trade, was found some 500 years later. The sheer scale of Avebury impresses all those who see it, but again, it is only from the air that its size can truly be appreciated. It is a place that has been imbued with spiritual energy for thousands of years. Yet older, and approached down the long avenue of standing stones from Avebury, is this ancient burial site, West Kennet Long Barrow. This is the largest burial chamber of its kind in Europe. Older than the pyramids, this is the site of 46 burials. It was sealed by Bronze Age hands 1,000 years after it was built, in order to keep tomb raiders out, or maybe the spirits of the departed in. It is said that a visitor on Midsummer Day at dusk may catch sight of a ghostly robed figure entering the tomb with his red-eared dog. By the time of the late Bronze Age, around 1000 BC, high-ranking people were being buried in mounds, or barrows. Here at Sixpenny Handley in Dorset are disc barrows, a round ring with several smaller mounds in the middle containing the dead and valuable possessions. Dating them to pre-Roman is easy on this site, as Ackerman Street, a main Roman road, cuts off one of the rings. It seems that bulldozing the past has always been around. Up in the Orkneys is Maze How, a burial chamber under a domed roof. Early man left little for us here, however later visitors did. A band of Vikings, led by Earl Harold Matherson and Ragnald, Earl of Moore, who sought shelter from a violent snowstorm sometime in the 12th century, left graffiti inside the tomb. From the Earl's party, 2 of the men went mad. Life, the Earl's cook, carved these runes. Ingigerd is the most beautiful of all women. How little has changed in 1,000 years. When the Romans invaded and occupied much of Britain, they sometimes buried their dead in a similar way. At the Bartlow Hills tumuli on the border of Essex and Cambridgeshire, 3 mounds exist where there were once 7. 4 were destroyed when the now disused railway line was built. One of them is the largest such mound in Europe, and yet the site is little known and not much visited. When the mounds were excavated, many artefacts were recovered and are now in Colchester Museum. It isn't necessary to look back to prehistory to find ourselves faced with enigmas. In 1939, here in the flat eastern county of Suffolk, excavations were underway at a farm called Sutton Hoo. Some circular mounds had been opened and nothing of great interest found. That all changed when the largest yielded an entire Anglo-Saxon ship, 30 metres long with places for 20 oars aside. it was the burial place of a king. A contemporary chronicler tells us, "They laid the beloved chieftain on the ship's bosom, glorious by the mast. Never have I heard a vessel more fairly fitted with war weapons and battle raiments, swords and coats of mail. On his breast lay a host of treasures." Everything a mighty warrior might need to ease his passage into the afterworld. But here's the mystery. No trace of human remains has ever been found. Almost all the landscape has now been tamed and farmed, but this rolling farmland near the South Downs in East Sussex was once a dark forest and home not to just early man, but also to his prey. A huge variety of animals: wolf, boar, wildcat and deer. Hunters roamed these gentle hills and sometimes left their mark in the landscape as chalk figures. Maybe the Long Man of Wilmington was one. There is a local legend which claims the two giants fought a battle. The loser lay where he fell, club in hand. The people carved his outline in the turf as a reminder of the mighty ones who went before. A figure with more striking attributes commands the hillside above Cerne Abbas in Dorset. He is held, unsurprisingly, to be a potent fertility symbol. Couples are still said to consummate their union on this hillside. But there's a debate as to whether this is actually an ancient hill carving, because there's no record of his existence before 1694. Some even say he is a rude image of Oliver Cromwell, the leader of Parliament's side in the Civil War. But old, or more recent, all chalk hill figures like the Cerne Abbas giant must have been weeded, recut, and just possibly enhanced over the centuries. Perhaps the equivalent of today's churches back in prehistory are the many stone circles across the country. The antiquity of Castlerigg is beyond doubt. It stands high on a hill near Keswick in Cumbria. These rough-hewn boulders were heaved upright some 5,000 years ago. Visitors today come to marvel that they still stand. Such structures are known to have had astronomical significance, forecasting the passage of the seasons, the phases of the sun and moon. Perhaps they also acted as a focal point for worshipping whatever gods these early people had. A few miles away, another stone circle remains intact, though a little smaller than Castlerigg. This is the Swinside Stone Circle near Egremont. The effort required to raise such a monument testifies to the importance that these sites must have had to early communities. High above the North Wales coast at Penmen Moor is a small stone circle. The location clearly had a spiritual significance because all around here evidence remains of other circles and burial sites. This giant stone circle, the third largest in Britain, is the Ringer of Brodgar. It is over 104 metres in diameter and forms part of a ritual landscape in the Orkney Islands. There were originally 60 stones in the ring, but only 27 survive today for visitors to marvel at. This circle, and a neighbouring one, may well have been named and used by later Vikings as the temples of the sun and moon, where young people made their vows and prayed to the Nordic god Woden, perhaps giving a clue to their original purpose in these northerly latitudes where light and warmth are vital to survival. And who were these people who built this ring in the first place and braved this savage climate? Perhaps those who lived here at Skara Brae, a few miles away. This extraordinary village is the most complete Neolithic settlement in Europe. As the Orkneys have few trees, roofs were formed of whalebone and turf. Inside, cupboards, shelves and comfortable seats were made of stone, the earliest built-in furniture. Skara Brae was abandoned about 4,500 years ago, maybe due to a worsening climate. The true reason remains a mystery locked in these extraordinary houses. Perhaps the greatest prehistory mystery is Stonehenge, the stone ring in Wiltshire and one of the most famous ancient sites in the world. Standing stark on an undulating plain near Salisbury, this is an amazing survival from a distant age. Amazing that it stands at all. Amazing in its pinpoint alignment with the midsummer and midwinter solstices, allowing for a magic few moments the rising or setting sun to touch the green stone altar at its centre. Sharing with the pyramids its astrological precision, it was built roughly at the same date. 5,000 midsummer suns have risen since Stonehenge was created, but by whom is not known. It is now claimed by the Druids, but they first appeared 3,000 years after the sacred site was first chosen. Most amazing of all, 80 blue stones that form part of the structure came from these mountains in West Wales. They were brought a distance of 240 miles by sea and land. Their weight, over 4 tons each. Imagine the effort to bring them all that way to Salisbury Plain in an age before the wheel. We know many facts about Stonehenge, the source of the stones, their age, their alignment. We also know that the whole area must have had some sort of spiritual significance due to all the burial chambers in the vicinity. But what we don't know is why this particular site, and who built it. With no written record, Stonehenge secrets remained locked in the stones. Of course, there's been no shortage of ideas suggested from across the centuries. One of the more modern theories concerns ley lines. England, as well as the Earth, is supposedly crisscrossed with bands of an invisible force called ley lines. Certainly, ancient tracks in South America connect temples in straight lines. Arbour Low in Derbyshire, the Stonehenge of the north, sits on the confluence of 50 such invisible paths. Is that just a coincidence? These limestone slabs lie flat. Perhaps they too were felled by early Christians, fearful of their spiritual pagan power. But no proof has shown they were ever upright in the first place. Even today, some local people won't go near this stone circle after dusk. Such is the aura of this remote spot. Our ancestors in these islands often built on a large scale. Many ancient hill forts can be found on high ground. They were places for shelter and defence. They were not always inhabited, as it was a refuge for local people living in dangerous times, where rival tribes threatened life and livestock. These ditches and high banks belong to one of the most impressive hill forts, Maidment Castle. Some reach a height of 10 metres and were a formidable obstacle for anyone attempting to storm the castle. But they were no obstacle for the Romans, who invaded Britain in 43 AD. They took the castle and much later built a small temple, which may have been dedicated to Minerva or Diana the huntress. Perhaps the Romans were making a point that their gods were superior to the old Celtic ones. Bath is a beautiful 18th century city in Somerset and a World Heritage Site. But over 2,000 years earlier, there was a Celtic shrine here dedicated to the goddess Sulis. When the Romans arrived, they liked what they found, the only natural hot springs in their new empire, and named the place Aquae Sulis. The waters from this spring had curative properties, and the Romans, being devoted to hygiene, soon constructed baths over the source of the healing waters. The spring flows unabated today, and was the cause of Bath's great flowering in the 18th century, when the city became the centre for fashionable living. Sweeping rows of elegant houses were built for the gentry. Buxton in Derbyshire also had a medicinal spring. Again, the Romans recognised its importance. Hundreds of years later, another coloniser of these islands, the Catholic Church, took charge of the healing waters and built a now demolished monastery over the source. Dedicated to St. Anne, Mother of Mary, the monks vigorously promoted the shrine, which became a place of pilgrimage. Like Bath, 18th century Buxton attracted fashionable people who came for social as well as health reasons. And this popularity continued into the 19th century with new hotels and a large domed sanatorium. The 18th century provided many ways for the rich to dispose of surplus funds. One was to build a sort of spiritual fantasy. Here at West Wickham, Sir Francis Dashwood decided to build himself a special club for his friends, but not near his house. He decided to dig it into the hill opposite his house and under the church and his family's mausoleum. Here he created the Hellfire Club. Its motto was, "Do as thou wilt," and myths and legends grew about what actually went on in this so-called spiritual, hedonistic place. The club was a mock religious order of high-living aristocrats who held their meetings in these hillside caves. The gentlemen worshipped Bacchus and Venus, both gods of fleshly pleasures. Through the hill flows a natural stream, which Dashwood named after the Styx, the river which in Greek mythology separated the earth from Hades, the underworld of the dead. In the late 18th century, the worship of nature began to become fashionable through philosophy, painting and poetry, and in particular by poets like William Wordsworth, who saw the nobility of the natural world, and in particular in the dramatic scenery of the Lake District. For centuries, mountains had been an inconvenience, a barrier to get round. Now they were something to admire and even climb. The landscape provided emotional and spiritual nourishment. No doubt those feelings are just as powerful today for these climbers in the Lake District, with an awe-inspiring view down to Ullswater. Nature has always worked its magic, and back before recorded history, rivers were said to have possessed magical and spiritual significance. They form boundaries, highways, and are as dangerous as they are useful. The River Severn is the longest of Britain's waterways. Now spanned by mighty bridges, it was a fearsome barrier to our forefathers, particularly the tides, because there is a difference of nearly 40 metres in level between high and low water, the second largest in the world. Named after the nymph Sabrina, who drowned in its waters, the Severn has its own magical event. At certain times of the year, across these muddy wastes, washes a mighty wave like a tsunami, carrying all before it. Known as the Severn Boar, it has been ridden by modern daredevils on surfboards. Earlier visitors might equally have spotted the Roman god Nodens astride his seahorse on the crest of the wave. Like all river gods, old Father Thames gives rise to folklore and myths. And in more modern times, stories that have entranced generations. And none more charming than the story of two riverside residents who lived upstream in the lush green of the Thames Valley. "Believe me, my young friend," said the rat, "there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as messing about in boats." So wrote Kenneth Grahame in one of the most popular children's books, The Wind in the Willows. Over the centuries, writers have done much to create myths and legends and turn places into a spiritual destination. On the cliffs of Cornwall, where the land meets the Atlantic, sits a place of legend, magic, and spirituality. This is Tintagel, where the 12th century chronicler, Geoffrey of Monmouth, said that the wizard Merlin tricked the beautiful Egerne into believing the man who came to her bed one distant night was her husband, the King of Cornwall. But it was Uther Pendragon, and the child he fathered was Arthur, the future king of these lands. In the 15th century, Sir Thomas Malory wrote Le Morte d'Arthur, a compilation of tales about the king and his knights of the Round Table. In the 19th century, the poet Alfred, or Tennyson, reworked Malory's tales into an epic poem and suggested Tintagel as the birthplace of Arthur. With the birth of Arthur began one of the most enduring of legends, one that has lodged in the consciousness of the nation for centuries. Seeing Tintagel perched high on its rocky cliffs, it's easy to believe in gallant knights, the ideals of chivalry, and the noble task of seeking the Holy Grail. Places like Tintagel were considered to possess special spiritual properties, and were often used by early missionaries to convert people to Christianity. When Pope Gregory dispatched St. Augustine to Britain in 595 AD to spread the word of God, he instructed that while images of heathen gods must be destroyed, ancient places of worship should be respected and, where possible, converted for use by the new religion. At Knowlton in Dorset, there is a remarkable example of this in a Christian church right in the middle of an ancient pagan ring. Even though the church dates from the Norman period, it is a clear indication of this crossover between a pagan and emerging Christian faith. This crossover even applied to the days of the week, which celebrated Germanic pagan gods. It's ironic that the day people were encouraged to go to church was a day that celebrated the pagan goddess Sunna, hence Sunday. Old Sarum in Wiltshire was converted from an Iron Age pagan fort to an Anglo-Saxon Christian shrine, and later a cathedral was built within the walls. The outlines of its history can be read on the ground. Not all early churches were built on so grand a scale. Here in Essex, the stones from a Roman fort were reused by a local Anglo-Saxon youth trained by the monks of Lindisfarne to raise a modest monastery. The building served as a barn for many centuries, which is why perhaps it has survived the years. Today it is once again a place of worship, celebrating both Christian and Celtic rites. Canterbury Cathedral, seat of the primate of the Anglican Church, saw in 1170 the murder of Thomas à Becket, the turbulent priest so troublesome to Henry II. 3 short years later, Becket was canonised. With St. Thomas, Canterbury had a martyr, and its future as a centre of pilgrimage was assured. and is still evident today in the number of visitors. The Norman conquerors of 1066 took religion very seriously, and within 100 years of the Battle of Hastings, most of the great cathedrals of England had been built. They are some of the finest religious buildings in the world. In 1076, Chichester Cathedral was begun, though what we see today is largely late 13th century, following a fire which meant substantial rebuilding. 3 years later, in 1079, Winchester was begun, and built with the longest nave of any Gothic cathedral in Europe. In the same year, 1079, Hereford Cathedral was started from the ruins of a Saxon church from 1056. One of its most famous treasures is the medieval map, Mappa Mundi. 1 year later, in 1080, York Minster was begun. It's one of the largest of its kind in Northern Europe, and its official title is the Cathedral and Metropolitical Church of St. Peter in York. In 1083, Ely in Cambridgeshire replaced an earlier church. It's often referred to as the Ship of the Fens, as it towers over the flat, watery landscape. The octagonal lantern was built after the central tower collapsed in 1322. In the 1940s, the lantern served as a landmark for American and British bomber pilots returning to local airfields from raids over Germany. It achieved mythic status for the crews of Lancaster bombers and became a symbol of homecoming and safety. The Norman construction of Southwell began in 1086, gradually replacing the earlier Saxon church. The unusual lead pyramidal spires, or pepper pot spires as they are known locally, are the only example in Britain. Gloucester Cathedral was started in 1089 as an abbey church. The cloisters are some of the earliest of their type in the country. In the late 19th century, the cathedral was extensively restored by Sir George Gilbert Scott. Durham is regarded as one of the finest examples of Norman architecture. It was begun in 1093 on the site of an earlier Saxon church and took nearly 100 years to complete. Like Durham, Norwich Cathedral is an almost complete Norman design and took just under 50 years to finish, starting in 1096. Across the border in Wales, St David's in Pembrokeshire was a wild and dangerous place, with several former churches destroyed by raiders. In 1115, the present cathedral was begun on the site of St David's original monastery. 3 years later, in 1118, Peterborough was begun. Its outstanding west face is well known for the 3 enormous arches, which has no architectural precedent in Britain. In 1175, Wells was begun and has often been described as the most poetic of the English cathedrals. The glories of the west front are the 300-odd statues, which were originally painted and gilded. Lichfield is the only medieval cathedral in England with 3 spires. It was begun in 1195, but during the Civil War in the 17th century, it suffered untold damage when it was besieged by the Royalist army. It was Sir George Gilbert Scott again who sensitively brought the cathedral back to life in the 19th century. By 1220, the Normans had given way to the Plantagenet kings and queens, and Salisbury Cathedral is one of the finest built in the new early English architectural style. It's also remarkable because it was built in only 38 years. The cathedral has the tallest spire at 123 metres and the largest cathedral close at around 80 acres in the whole of Britain. Perhaps the most famous cathedral, which is not a cathedral, is Westminster Abbey, begun in 1245. It was Henry VIII who made it a cathedral to avoid having it destroyed as an abbey during the dissolution of the monasteries. It became an abbey again when Henry's Catholic daughter Mary gave it back to the monks. Under Protestant Queen Elizabeth, it remained an abbey, but responsible directly to the monarch, not a bishop, which is still the case today. With all these great cathedrals still in use, it would be centuries before another was built, and only then because the original was burned down. St Paul's Cathedral, designed by Sir Christopher Wren in 1677, replaced a former building which burnt down in the Great Fire of London. It's the only classical cathedral in the country. It was also the first Protestant cathedral to be built, because until the relatively recent Reformation in the 16th century, all the churches and cathedrals in Britain had been Catholic. And in fact, it wasn't until the 19th century that Parliament finally passed the Catholic Relief Act, which enabled Catholic churches to be built once again. In 1962, the new Catholic cathedral in Liverpool was built, which is known locally as Paddy's Wigwam. It stands close to the Protestant cathedral, another 20th century building. Liverpool Cathedral was begun in 1904, but took until 1978 to be completed. It was designed by Giles Gilbert Scott, the grandson of Sir George Gilbert Scott, who had restored so many of the old cathedrals. From virtual exclusion in previous centuries, other mainstream religions began to build spiritual places for prayer. Mosques began to appear in Britain's cities. This one is in Coventry. Another in Leicester, Blackburn, and Luton. In the West Midlands at Tividale is the Sri Venkateswari Balaji Hindu Temple, opened in 1999. And on the banks of Morecambe Bay in Cumbria is a Kadampa Buddhist temple, built in the 1990s at Connie's Head Priory. The priory had started life as a medieval monastery back in the 12th century, but shut down under Henry VIII in the mid-16th century. This was the century which saw one of the greatest upheavals in Christianity, as the Reformation tore the Christian faith into the two opposing camps of Catholicism and Protestantism. And along with Henry VIII's fight with the Pope over his first divorce, the result was the destruction of hundreds of powerful and rich monasteries, leaving a heritage of empty ruins and some of the most atmospheric and spiritual places in the land. This is Fountains Abbey, and when it was first founded, it was in a wilderness, as described by a monk at the time. A place remote from all the world, uninhabited, set about by thorns, fit more, it seemed, for the dens of wild beasts than uses of mankind. It was begun by the monks from York, who felt their life in a great city too easy, too far from their vows. Those early pioneers had to cook and eat elm leaves to survive. Legend has it that one day, having given their last meal to a passing beggar, they were rewarded by the unexpected arrival of a cart bearing a great store of food. And from then on, their troubles diminished, and this great monastic complex rose from the ground. Eventually, Fountains Abbey owned 600,000 acres of Yorkshire. Tintern Abbey, in a remote spot on the River Wye, was pulled down to leave a romantic ruin, inspiration for artists, poets and tourists. In 1847, Tennyson wrote his poem, Tears, Idle Tears, following a visit to Tintern. It was for him the bygone memories that fired the imagination. Tears, idle tears, I know not what they mean. Tears from the depth of some divine despair rise in the heart and gather to the eyes. In looking on the happy autumn fields and thinking of the days that are no more. Here, in these glorious surroundings, Cistercian monks kept their vows of silence, poverty and chastity, while with prayer and physical labour they raised this great monument. At the other end of the comfort spectrum was Castle Acre Priory, whose monks lived in such luxury that the prior's house was more like a mansion than a monastic dwelling. Used to living well, the Cluniac brethren lacked the discipline shown by their brothers in stricter orders. At Bury St Edmunds, little remains of the original great abbey, although some ruins are clearly visible beside today's cathedral. Edmund, the saint after whom the abbey was named, was killed by Viking raiders in the year 870. They cut off his head, and it could not be found by Edmund's followers. Later, a ghostly voice summoned them to a thicket of brambles, where a grey wolf stood guard over the head. It was reunited with the body and interred in the church. When the remains were moved many years later, it was discovered that the head and body had miraculously rejoined. A great pilgrimage church rose over the tomb. The monastery became very wealthy. When Henry VI spent Christmas with the monks, they entertained him so royally, he and the entire court stayed for 4 months, nearly bankrupting the abbey. Not all spiritual and sacred places need to be large and impressive. In the corner of this field near Rushton in Northamptonshire is perhaps one of the most extraordinary religious buildings in the country, designed by Sir Thomas Tresham after his release from prison for being a Catholic in 1593. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, a certain freedom of worship was tolerated, and in this folly, Tresham declared his Catholic faith. He designed it to show his belief in the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and the number 3 is represented everywhere. 3 walls, each 33 feet long, and each with 3 triangular windows, and surmounted by 3 gargoyles. The building has 3 floors, a triangular chimney adorned with trefoils, a Latin inscription around the edge with 33 letters, and, well, that's just the outside. Many spiritual places are often found in remote locations to find peace and quiet, and an island offers an added benefit of being cut off from the rest of the world. One of them is Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast. It was from here that Christianity was brought to the northeast of England in the 1st century AD, and the abbey became a centre of art and learning, famous throughout Europe. These ruins are from a later abbey, but still provide an atmospheric reminder of a terrible event that happened here in 793. Lindisfarne, or as it's also known, Holy Island, is joined at low tide by a causeway, which gave security at high water from an attack from the land. It did not, however, protect the monks from the sea, and it was from the sea that the Viking raiders attacked. An English monk at the time recorded that never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. The saints were, of course, the monks, who became martyrs. Off the west coast of Scotland are some of the oldest rocks on Earth, and some of them form the island of Iona. From this desolate spot, the Christian faith reached out to Scotland and the north. Irish-born St Columba and his 12 monks established a community, and the monastery they founded in 563 became the most revered in Scotland. Kings were brought here for burial, Scottish, Irish, Scandinavian. They rest in a place whose spiritual heartbeat is felt by all who visit. The spiritual atmosphere surrounding Iona is echoed in other enchanting places across Britain. Of all magical places in Scotland, none equals Fingal's Cave. On the island of Staffa, this amazing natural structure stands on pillars of volcanic rock, unscathed by the eternal pounding waves. The sound those waves create echoes inside the cavern. Its Gaelic name means Cave of Melody. It writes its own symphony daily, and translated by Felix Mendelssohn into the Hebrides Overture. If Scotland is the land of myths, then Wales is the home of dragons and knights. From the summit of Mount Snowdon, the whole of Wales is laid before you. The view is spectacular, and for those not wishing to make the long climb to the top, a 19th century train saves the struggle for a large number of tourists who visit every year. A mountain of this size inspires awe, and awe in turn gives birth to legends. There is one about the Celtic king, Vortigern, who determined to erect a fort on the lower slopes of the mountain, but was constantly frustrated. Every night, the work done the previous day fell down. His counsellors advised him to find a boy with no parents, who should be sacrificed to appease the spirits opposing the king's work. The boy they found told the king to ignore his advisors and to dig down beneath the fort where he would find a magic lake. Under this lake, 2 dragons were at constant war. It was their fighting which shook down the walls. It was as the boy said, and perhaps it is no great surprise to find his name was Merlin. The dragons, released from the mountain, continued their disputes elsewhere. The Red Dragon of Wales finally defeated his English opponent and became the eternal symbol of the country. There are many Arthurian legends in these hills and valleys. Snowdonia is reputed to be the final resting place of Arthur's sword, Excalibur. The dying king instructed one of his knights to throw it into Llyn Ogwen. The scene is beautifully described in Mallory's Mort d'Arthur. Then Sir Bedivere lightly took up the sword and went to the waterside, and threw the sword as far as he might. And there came an arm above the water and met it, and so shook it thrice, and brandished, and then vanished away the hand with the sword in the water. Who knows, perhaps the magical Excalibur really does lie sleeping deep in a Welsh lake. This spiritual journey draws to an end in Somerset, at perhaps one of the most evocative places, Glastonbury. And once again, King Arthur is at its centre. This was the Isle of Avalon, surrounded by water, which has long since disappeared. Glastonbury, now famous for its music festival, has been a place of spiritual significance for many centuries. Here, Joseph of Arimathea was said to have planted his staff in the ground, and from it sprang the miraculous Glastonbury thorn, whose descendants still thrive, blooming at Christmas time. Legend has it that he founded a monastery to house the Holy Grail, and it eventually became one of the greatest abbeys in the land. Arthur and Guinevere are said to be buried here, side by side, near the high altar. And overlooking the abbey is Glastonbury Tor, a steep hill with a church tower on top. Ley lines, those invisible paths of magnetic force, meet at this point. This has long been a haunting and haunted location. The Celts thought the Tor was the entrance to the underworld. Many local people still avoid it at night. In Glastonbury, the spiritual and sacred meet myths and legends. For many people, just standing in one of the great cathedrals gives a sense of peace and goodness, a real sense of the spiritual. For others, it might be wandering around the prehistory sites of our pagan ancestors. And the landscape itself provides a kind of spiritual nourishment, a feeling of being at one with nature. In an age when science strives to understand and explain everything, perhaps it's as well that some things are left as mysteries, and so fire the imagination of all those in search of spiritual Britain.